This video comes to you by popular demand. It has been requested time and time again in the comments box. What better way than to mark the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV than looking at the papal tiara, the tri-regnum, the triple crown, an item of headgear that popes no longer use. It is a unique object in Western European culture that developed in the late Middle Ages, and in that period it expressed the papacy's understanding of itself, its temporal as well as its spiritual authority, and its importance as an institution in the Western world. Its disuse in the 20th century likewise signals a changing attitude by the Catholic Church to the Pope's role and relationship with temporal power. So in this video I'm going to do a number of things. I'm going to attempt to trace the origin of the papal tiara in the late Middle Ages, how, when and why it developed. As we move along, I will also look at some of the more striking examples of papal tiaras, both lost and surviving over the course of the past 700 years. I'll look very briefly at the ritual of the papal coronation, as it describes the symbolism of the tiara, as this might help to understand why the papacy abandoned such a symbolically loaded object. So let's start at the very beginning. For the first millennium or so of the Church's history, the papal tiara didn't exist, but neither did the bishop's mitre. It seems that both the papal tiara and the bishop's mitre began to develop in the 11th and early 12th century from the same form of hat. It was a close-fitting cap that was used as everyday wear by all bishops in both the East and the West, and was called the camelaucum in Latin. The name demonstrates the universality of this hat, as it is a Latinization of a Greek word, camelaucum, which means a hat made from camel skin. Fashions change over time, and in the 11th century bishops began to wear a two-lobed version of the camelaucum, which then developed in the 12th century into the doubled horned mitre that we know now. This mitre in Munich dates from circa 1200 and has on it a depiction of the martyrdoms of St Stephen and St Thomas Becket, and it shows what a mitre of the late 12th and early 13th century looked like after it had just evolved from the camelaucum. At much the same time, perhaps to differentiate himself and his apostolic authority from that of other bishops in the church, for formal occasions, the Bishop of Rome began to wear a taller, conical version of the camelaucum. For less formal wear, he continued to wear a camelaucum as before, which evolved into the so-called camaro, or the red fur-trimmed velvet hat that popes continued to wear until the 20th century. Indeed, Pope Benedict XVI was sometimes seen sporting one too. The taller, conical, more formal camelaucum is what eventually developed into the papal tiara, but it wasn't known as such until much later in history. In the 11th and 12th century, this conical camelaucum was either known by that name in the official records, or more often, as time went on, as a pileum phrygium. This name, pileum phrygium, derives from the name given to two other pieces of conical headwear from the ancient world. The first one, the pileus, was a common Roman travelling hat which had associations with liberty and freedom. In Roman society, it was given to freed slaves as a symbol of their newly won freedom. The second, the Phrygian cap, was supposedly worn by the Phrygians, the inhabitants of Anatolia in the ancient world. I'm not sure there was any implied symbolism to the use of this name. It is a purely descriptive term. This image from the Barberini Exalted roll made at Monte Cassino in 1058 shows a pope wearing a pileum phrygium. Notice at the bottom of it is a decorative band. This in time would develop into the first crown of the papal tiara. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th century, the papal pileum phrygium gradually grew taller and taller, and the bottom band of it was further embellished. This image of Pope Innocent III dates from 1219, 3 years after the end of his pontificate and as part of a series of wall paintings in the cloister of the Benedictine monastery at Sacro Specco. You can see that the band at the base of the pileum phrygium has become more elaborate and crown-like in style. It was Innocent III who firmly established the Pope's sovereignty over the Papal States in Italy, and the more crown-like appearance of this band might coincide with the Popes becoming more firmly temporal rulers. Here is Innocent III again, and also Pope Gregory IX, who was Pope from 1227 to 1241, depicted on mosaics from Old St. Peter's in Rome. And the band of the pileum phrygium is clearly jewelled here, but the upper part is depicted as made of fabric. Notice too that there are two pendants hanging from the back of Innocent's pileum phrygium. These are lappets, a feature that also appears on mitres, a feature that the later papal tiara would also have. There is no indication until the second half of the 13th century that the pileum phrygium is anything other than a fabric hat, but it then begins to develop into the tiara we know. Here is Pope Nicholas III, who was Pope from 1277 to 1280, depicted in a fresco at the Sancta Sanctorum Chapel in the Lateran. His pileum phrygium is evidently made of figured fabric, but it is much taller and it's topped with some sort of knop or finial. The band or bottom crown, as it would soon become, is evidently jewelled. It was Pope Boniface VIII who was elected Pope in 1294, who commissioned what we might think of as the first proper papal tiara, and here he is in a sculpture wearing it. It is a much taller cone-shaped hat with a giant knop on the top, and we know that it was greatly embellished. A 1295 inventory of the papal treasury states that it was enriched with 48 large and numerous smaller balass rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, and 66 large pearls. And at the very summit, and that's what this gigantic knop is, was a very large ruby. At some point during his pontificate, Boniface VIII added the second crown to this tiara, and we can get some impression of what this two-crown tiara looked like in its final form from the tomb of Boniface in the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The second crown was added by Boniface VIII to the tiara to emphasise the universal authority of the Pope. Boniface was very hot on this, and in 1302, at the very end of his pontificate, he had issued the papal bull Unum Sanctum, in which the claim was made that the papacy held supreme authority on earth above all secular rulers. At some point in the 14th century, Boniface VIII's tiara became known as the Tiara of St. Sylvester, after the Pope who reigned during the time of Constantine the Great. That is no accident whatsoever. Pope Sylvester was an important figure in the whole issue of papal temporal authority. This needs to be the subject of yet another video, but the papacy relied upon a forged medieval document called the Donation of Constantine to justify the authority over temporal princes within the former Western Roman Empire, a document that was allegedly an agreement between Constantine and Pope Sylvester. Boniface's tiara, the tiara of St. Sylvester, became an icon in a sense of that papal authority and was considered a holy relic. As I've talked about before at great length, relic crowns were commonplace in the medieval period in Western Europe and helped create a sense of spiritual legitimacy to claims of political power. When Pope Clement V was elected Pope in France in 1305, great pains were taken to ensure that he was crowned with the tiara of Saint Sylvester, so it was duly taken from Rome to Lyon for his coronation, and it remained in France during the whole of the Avignon papacy. And it was during the Avignon papacy, either during the pontificate of Clement V himself or his successor John XXII, that the third crown or circlet was added to the tiara, and it thus developed its final form as the tri-regnum. The Avignon popes, Benedict XII and Clement VI, are both depicted with a triple tiara on their tomb effigies. The reason for the addition of a third crown is rather obscure. It has been suggested that the popes were attempting to ensure that they weren't outdone by the Holy Roman Emperors. The Holy Roman Emperor in this period was generally crowned 3 times as King of the Romans, with the crown of Charlemagne at Aachen, then with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, and then with the Imperial Crown in Rome, and a triple tiara for the Pope at least expressed an equal jurisdiction. The term tiara was first applied to this extraordinary object in the 14th century too. Again, the word is purely descriptive. Tiara is in fact a Latinization of a Persian word that was used to describe a type of turban encircled by a crown that was worn by the Turco-Mongol rulers of the Persian Timurid dynasty. Here is the Emperor Timur, the founder of that dynasty, better known in English as Tamburlaine of Christopher Marlowe's play, wearing his imperial tiara. It seems that the papal tiara simply owes its name to its resemblance to this exotic Eastern crown. The tiara of St. Sylvester was used for coronations of all the popes in Avignon and later those in Rome after the papacy had returned there. On its return to Rome, it was kept in the Lateran treasury, but was stolen with other objects in 1485 and was never seen again. Although a great loss given its history and significance, popes didn't exactly do without, and successive 15th and 16th century popes commissioned numerous new tiaras. The fabric origins of the tiara as the pileum phrygium were soon lost, as both Eugene IV, who reigned from 1431 to 47, and Calixtus III, who reigned from 1455 to 58, both commissioned tiaras that were made entirely of silver gilt. Successive popes embellished these tiaras further. Paul II commissioned 2 more tiaras in the 1460s that were valued at 120,000 and 200,000 florins apiece, and he spent a further 50,000 florins during his pontificate embellishing them with further jewels. In 1484, Pope Sixtus IV spent 10,000 ducats on pearls and stones to embellish his tiara, which was valued at 110,000 florins. Pope Julius II added to one of these existing tiaras a 120-carat ruby, which cost him 2,300 florins. That rather put into the shade the measly ruby that Boniface VIII had put on the top of the tiara of St. Sylvester. As rulers of the papal states, and with vast reserves of wealth, money was no object when it came to the adornment of this ultimate symbol of papal authority and power. It was due to the clash of power between the Pope and the temporal rulers that none of these late medieval tiaras now survived. Before the sack of Rome in 1527, Pope Clement VII had many of the tiaras melted down, and others were pawned in order to raise the 400,000 ducat ransom that was demanded by the Emperor Charles V, who was holding him prisoner. Although none of the medieval tiaras survived, a single Renaissance tiara did survive the sack of Rome, and only because Clement had placed it in a pawn shop. This tiara was made for Pope Julius II by the Milanese jeweller Cristoforo Foppa. Pope Julius told his master of ceremonies that the tiara cost him the princely sum of 200,000 ducats. This tiara, which was bought back from the pawnbroker by Paul III, survived until the end of the 18th century. It was apparently refashioned by Pope Pius VI in the last quarter of the 18th century. Of course, Pope Pius VI would end up being Napoleon Bonaparte's prisoner and would die in France in captivity. And the tiara of Julius II was unfortunately among the papal treasures that was looted by Napoleon's army as it captured Rome in 1798. Fortunately, a number of drawings were made of it, so we have some sense of the extraordinary opulence of late medieval and Renaissance tiaras. The tiara is formed into 7 bands, which are divided from one another by strings of pearls. The lowest band is an inscription recording the creation of the tiara in the 7th year of Pope Julius II's pontificate, i.e. 1510, while the upper 6 bands represent the 3 crowns. The 3 bands that represent the circlets of the crowns were apparently decorated with enamel and scrollwork and studded with a mixture of rubies and sapphires. The 3 that provided a sort of cresting for the circlets were set with further rubies and sapphires, alternating with gilt strawberry leaves, each with a diamond in the centre, and the whole background of the tiara was studded with hundreds of pearls. It seems that the majority of these very fine tiaras from centuries past were kept in the papal treasury in the Castel Sant'Angelo, and that is where Pope Julius II's tiara was when it was drawn in the early 18th century, kept in a circular strong room that was completed after the sack of Rome by Pope Paul III. I said that all the tiaras went in 1798, and that's not strictly true. There is one that survived the Napoleonic looting, a tiara that was apparently made during the pontificate of Gregory XIII between 1572 and 1585. This tiara is a bit of a mystery object. It is a non-standard shape, being more in the shape of an egg than the usual cone-shaped tiara. It can't have been very practical and wearable, and it may be due to its odd shape that the looters didn't recognise it for what it was, and it somehow survived. After the French capture of Rome and the Papal States, the cardinals fled, and at the death of Pius VI in August of 1799, it took them nearly 7 months to come together again. They finally met in March of 1800 in Venice, and they elected Pius VII as pontiff. As there was no papal tiara at hand to crown him with, one had to be hastily fashioned, and it was made from a base of papier-mâché with gilt base metal crowns around it, and it was set with stones that were donated by Venetian families. After his final return to Rome in 1814, after the fall of Napoleon, Pius VII had a lightweight silver gilt tiara made. The third oldest surviving tiara was donated by Napoleon to Pius VII in 1805. It was given to the Pope as a present following his journey to Paris to preside at the Emperor's coronation in December of 1804. It is debatable what Napoleon's motive was in making this gift. In 1805, Pius was once again in possession of the Papal States, and he was resident in Rome. They had been gifted back to him by Napoleon after the French invasion. The tiara was made so that it was too small to be worn, which was likely a pointed gesture from the French Emperor, but he could make or break the papacy if he wanted to do so. Indeed, in 1808, Napoleon would kick Pius out of Rome and the Papal States once again. Regardless, the Napoleon tiara was an extraordinarily lavish gift. It was designed and made by Henri Auguste and Marie-Etienne Nito of the House of Chaumet in Paris. The background of the tiara is white silk velvet, but the 3 crowns are made of solid gold. Due to the use of gold rather than silver gilt, the tiara is by far the heaviest. It weighs a staggering 18 pounds, nearly 8 kilograms. Many of the precious stones and pearls it was adorned with came from earlier papal tiaras. They had either been given to the French Directorate in 1797 by Pius VI as part payment for the extortionate demands of the Treaty of Tolentino, or they were looted by the army in 1798. The enormous faceted emerald of 404 carats that supports the cross on the top of the tiara once formed the summit of the tiara of Julius II. So there was a sense that Napoleon, as well as being pointed in giving this tiara, was making some reparation too. In 1834, the tiara was slightly modified so it could be worn, and it was used to crown a number of 19th century pontiffs. In the 20th century, Pope Benedict XV had all the jewels removed and replaced with glass. The originals were then sold to raise money to support wounded soldiers in the First World War. In 1805, the Pope had only those two tiaras, the papier-mâché one and the Napoleon tiara, but by the end of the 19th century there were more tiaras in the papal collection than ever before in history. Numerous tiaras were given to successive popes as gifts. The bejewelled Spanish tiara was given to Pius IX as a gift by Queen Isabella II of Spain and was presented to him in 1855. The Belgian tiara was the collective gift of the women of the court of King Leopold II of Belgium, and that arrived in the collection in 1871. And the donations continued under Pope Leo XIII. In 1887, to commemorate his 50 years as a priest, the Lutheran Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany gave Leo the German tiara studded with 1,000 pearls. The so-called Paris tiara was given to Leo in 1888 by the French Catholic Church to commemorate his 10-year anniversary as Pope, while the Austrian tiara was a gift from the Emperor Franz Joseph in 1894. The golden tiara was commissioned in 1903 after a public subscription to celebrate Pope Leo's 25 years as the successor of Peter. It is ironic that these symbols of papal power should be given in such numbers at a time when there were already challenges to papal temporal authority. They would, within a century, become redundant, mere museum pieces. Which brings us on to the papal coronation. From the Middle Ages, when the tiara first developed, until 1963, after election by the conclave, it was customary for the Pope to receive a coronation. The tiara used for coronations, from that of Leo XIII in 1878 to that of John XXIII in 1958, was a tiara made in 1877 for Pius IX called the Palatine tiara. It was given to the Pope as a gift from the Papal Palatine Guard to commemorate the Golden Jubilee of his consecration as a bishop. He was only 35 when he was consecrated bishop. This tiara, which was made of silver gilt, was lighter than some others in the collection, and it only weighed 2 pounds, but it was beautifully and opulently decorated. It was embellished with 6 rows of pearls, as well as an array of precious stones and enamel, and on the summit of the tiara was a globe enamelled in blue and topped by a cross set with 11 brilliant cut diamonds. In the Middle Ages, apart from during the time of the Avignon papacy, papal coronations took place in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Pope's own cathedral. After the end of the Western Schism, the coronation was then moved to St. Peter's Basilica and has taken place there, with a few exceptions, ever since. There was then a separate enthronement at the Lateran at a later date. The coronation, as performed in the last 2 centuries before its abolition, took place in the context of a papal mass. The Pope was carried from the Apostolic Palace to the altar of the Confessio in the Basilica on a throne called the sedia gestatoria, a carrying chair. The Pope, on this procession, was flanked on each side by huge ostrich feather fans called flabella, and over him was carried a white canopy. And during this procession he wore a jewelled mitre. On the way towards the altar, this glorious procession stopped 3 times, and a bunch of flax tied to a golden rod was burnt before the Pope's eyes, as the master of ceremonies said to him, "Holy Father, sic transit gloria mundi," so passes all the glory of the world. The Mass began at the foot of the altar with the confession, and then the Pope was once again seated on the sedia gestatoria, and he was then invested with a vestment called a pileum, a vestment that's symbolic of papal service. It's made of wool, and it is said to represent a sheep resting on the Pope's shoulders, a reminder to him that he must emulate Christ the Good Shepherd. The Mass would then continue. At the end of the Mass, the Pope would be seated once again in the sedia gestatoria, and would be carried to the place of coronation. Since its construction in the 17th century, the coronation ceremony, except for that of Leo III in 1878, which took place in the Sistine Chapel, took place on the central balcony of the Basilica, the same place where the results of the papal election are announced by the senior cardinal deacon. The Pope was enthroned there, and the senior cardinal deacon removed the Pope's mitre and placed on his head the tiara. Now, over recent centuries, the symbolism of the Triple Crown has been somewhat spiritualised. Some have suggested that the three crowns on the tiara represent the Pope's role as the Vicar of Christ, emulating the triple ministry of Jesus as prophet, priest and king. Another suggestion is that the three crowns represent the Church militant here on earth, the Church in purgatory and the Church triumphant in heaven. However, once the Cardinal Deacon had crowned the Pope, he addressed him directly, telling him the tiara's meaning. There was no mucking about, there was no theologising in what he said. Receive the tiara adorned with three crowns, and know that you are the father of princes and kings, the ruler of the world, and the vicar of our Lord Jesus Christ on earth, to whom alone are due honour and glory for ever and ever. The tiara represented the Pope's power and authority, both over the temporal and the spiritual realms. Paul VI was the last Pope to receive a coronation in 1963, and he was crowned with a new custom-made tiara, very much the product of the 1960s. It was the gift of his previous Diocese of Milan and was designed by Sculio Beato Angelico. It was made of silver with three light gold bands around it to represent the three crowns. The base of the tiara had a deeper circlet too, so really it was a four-crown tiara. There were a few stones set in it, but not the profusion of past centuries. In November of 1964, still in the midst of the reforming Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI would cease to use the tiara entirely. He laid it upon the altar and he never wore it again. In the end, it was sold to provide money for the poor, and it was donated by its purchaser to the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., where it can still be seen. The papal coronation and the use of the tiara have never been officially abandoned, but all of Paul VI's successors have chosen not to use it and have had a papal inauguration mass instead. The papal tiara was a creation of the late Middle Ages, when the papacy were enmeshed in the power dynamics of Western European politics, and it is not, of course, an indispensable symbol of the papacy. Such a symbol that represents the Pope's temporal authority over the world is without question an awkward one for the present-day Church. Tiaras have been made for and donated to recent popes, including John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, but all three looked on in bewilderment as they were presented with them. Indeed, the present Pope and his two predecessors have even removed the papal tiara from their coat of arms, and I doubt we'll ever see this object worn again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.